Consider for a moment the Mediterranean Sea as it appeared 3,000 years ago. The same blue waters, the same sun glinting off waves, the same winds filling canvas sails. But to the ancient mariner, this sea held terrors we can scarcely imagine. It was not yet mapped, not yet tamed, not yet safe. And prowling its depths were the first sea wolves men who discovered that taking was easier than trading, that fear was more profitable than friendship. The story of piracy is older than most realize. It predates the Caribbean buccaneers by millennia. It begins not with Blackbeard or Henry Morgan, but in the Bronze Age, in the era when empires were still young and the sea was the only highway between civilizations. The Phoenicians understood this truth. These remarkable traders from what we now call Lebanon became the first true masters of Mediterranean navigation. Their merchant vessels, heavy with cedar wood and purple dye, crisscrossed the ancient world. But here is what Homer and other ancient writers reveal. Some Phoenician captains discovered a darker trade. Why negotiate when you might simply take? Why pay for slaves when captives could be seized from undefended coasts? The practice spread like wildfire. The Mediterranean, that great cradle of Western civilization, became a hunting ground. By the time of classical Greece, piracy was so endemic that historians barely remarked upon it. It was simply the way of the sea. Coastal villages were built inland, away from the shore, for a grim reason. The sight of strange sails on the horizon meant terror. It meant raiders would come in the night, burning, killing, taking captives to sell in distant markets. Entire communities could vanish overnight. The sea gave life through trade and fishing, but it also brought death on swift wings. The Cilicians perfected this dark art. From their strongholds along the southern coast of what we now call Turkey, they built something unprecedented, an organized pirate empire. Imagine carved fortresses in towering cliffs, accessible only by secret paths known to the initiated, hidden harbors where hundreds of ships could shelter from storms and pursuing navies alike, a network spanning the entire Mediterranean. These were not simple brigands. The Cilician pirates created a sophisticated society, one with supply chains, intelligence networks, and diplomatic relations with corrupt officials. They knew which merchants carried the richest cargoes. They knew which Roman governors could be bribed to look the other way. They developed ships specifically designed for raiding fast, maneuverable vessels that could strike and disappear before heavier warships could respond. At their height, the Cilician pirates controlled more than 1,000 ships, 1,000 vessels crewed by tens of thousands of desperate men, escaped slaves, exiled criminals, and ambitious adventurers. They did not merely raid merchant shipping. They were bold enough, audacious enough, to attack coastal cities within sight of Rome itself. They kidnapped Roman citizens by the thousands. They disrupted grain supplies to the Eternal City, threatening famine. Rome tolerated much, but threatening its food supply crossed an uncrossable line. The response, when it came, was devastating. In 67 before the Common Era, Rome granted unprecedented powers to a general named Pompey the Great. He was given command of the entire Mediterranean and every warship Rome could muster. 500 vessels, 120,000 soldiers and sailors, authority to make war or peace as he saw fit. What followed was one of the most remarkable military campaigns in history. In a single season, just 3 months, Pompey systematically swept the Mediterranean clean. He divided the sea into 13 sectors, assigning a fleet to each. The pirate strongholds that had seemed impregnable fell one after another. Hidden harbors were discovered and blockaded. The networks of corruption were exposed and destroyed. 20,000 pirates surrendered or died. But before Pompey's great campaign, there was another encounter, one that reveals something profound about the nature of piracy and power. The year was 75 before the Common Era. A young Roman nobleman, barely 25 years old, was sailing to Rhodes to study rhetoric. His name was Julius Caesar. Pirates intercepted his ship near the island of Pharmacusa. They seized him, took his companions captive, and demanded a ransom of 20 talents of silver, an enormous sum. Caesar laughed at them. Here is what he said, according to Plutarch. 20 talents? I am worth at least 50. The pirates, bemused by this strange captive who seemed to have no fear, agreed. While messengers were dispatched to raise the ransom, Caesar spent 38 days as their prisoner. And here the story becomes almost unbelievable. He did not cower or plead. He participated in their exercises. He recited poetry to them. When they did not appreciate his verses, he called them illiterate barbarians to their faces. He told them repeatedly, with absolute certainty, that once he was free he would return and crucify every last one of them. The pirates thought this hilarious. They had captured a mad, arrogant youth who amused them with his bravado. The ransom was paid. Caesar was released. He immediately sailed to Miletus, raised a fleet, returned to Pharmacusa, and captured the pirates in their sleep. He recovered his ransom money and took all their treasure besides. Then, true to his word, he had them crucified. As a mercy, for they had treated him well during his captivity, he ordered their throats cut before the crosses were raised. This story tells us something crucial. Even in captivity, even outnumbered and seemingly helpless, Caesar never doubted his ultimate triumph. The pirates had made a fatal error. They had mistaken a temporary advantage for true power. They did not understand that the force of empire, once roused, would be implacable. But there were older terrors than the Cilicians, older mysteries than Caesar's capture. In the 12th century before the Common Era, the entire eastern Mediterranean convulsed in catastrophe. The great Bronze Age civilizations, the Hittites, the Mycenaeans, the mighty kingdoms of Syria and Canaan, all collapsed within a span of 50 years. Egyptian records speak of invaders coming from the sea. They called them simply the Sea Peoples. We do not know who they were. We do not know their language or their homeland. The records are fragmentary, contradictory, haunting in their incompleteness. Egyptian temple walls show images of fierce warriors in horned helmets arriving in ships, bringing their families, their possessions. These were not raiders seeking treasure and returning home. These were entire nations on the move. The pharaoh Ramesses III claimed victory against them, but Egypt was so weakened by these conflicts that it never truly recovered. Other kingdoms were not so fortunate. The great Hittite capital Hattusa burned. Mycenaean palaces across Greece went up in flames. Trade networks that had endured for centuries simply ceased to exist. Some scholars believe the Sea Peoples were refugees fleeing famine or natural disaster. Others argue they were confederated pirates who grew powerful enough to topple kingdoms. The truth, if we ever discover it, may lie somewhere between. What remains certain is this. Seaborne raiders brought down the most powerful civilizations of their age. The Mediterranean became a dark sea, and for centuries afterward, the Great Bronze Age was remembered only in myths and legends. Homer's epics, written centuries later, preserve echoes of this lost world. When Odysseus encounters strangers, they ask him, "Are you a merchant or a pirate?" As if these were equally respectable professions, as if taking by force was simply another way of making a living. And perhaps, in that violent age, it was. The ancient world accepted piracy as an unchangeable fact of maritime life, like storms or sea monsters. Coastal communities built watchtowers and maintained militias. Merchants travelled in convoys. Navies escorted valuable cargoes. But the pirates remained, generation after generation, because the equation was simple. The rewards of successful piracy exceeded any honest living the sea could provide. One captured merchant ship could make a pirate crew wealthy beyond dreams. One raid on a prosperous coastal town could yield more than a year of farming or fishing, and if caught, well, death was quick, and life was cheap in the ancient world. The Romans eventually brought a kind of order to the Mediterranean. Pompey's campaign was followed by centuries of Roman naval dominance. The Mare Nostrum, our sea, became reasonably safe for commerce, but Rome's peace required constant vigilance, constant force. The moment that force weakened, the pirates returned. They always returned. During the crisis of the 3rd century, when Rome fractured and rival emperors warred against each other, piracy resurged with horrifying speed. The same waters that had been safe for generations became hunting grounds once more. This pattern would repeat throughout history. Wherever central authority weakened, wherever naval power faltered, pirates emerged from the shadows, like predators scenting weakness. Why? Because piracy is not merely crime. It is a response to opportunity, to desperation, to the eternal mathematics of risk and reward. It flourishes in the spaces between empires, in the cracks of civilization. It cannot be completely eradicated because the sea is vast and ships are small, and the temptation to take by force is as old as humanity itself. The ancient pirates left us few written records. They were illiterate, mostly, and even when educated men like Julius Caesar's captors could read, they knew better than to document their crimes. What remains are the accounts of their victims, the records of those who fought them, the archaeological evidence of burned cities and hidden treasures. But we can imagine their perspective. Picture a young man in ancient Cilicia, born to poverty in a harsh land. The sea lies before him, glittering with possibility. Honest work might earn him enough to survive. Fishing, if lucky, might feed his family. But a single raid, a single captured merchantman, laden with Egyptian grain or Greek wine or Syrian purple that could transform his life. The risk of death or slavery? He faces that risk already. At least as a pirate he might die free and rich rather than poor and enslaved. This is the eternal temptation. This is why piracy persists across millennia and cultures. It offers a desperate gamble to desperate men, and sometimes the gamble pays off. The greatest pirates of the ancient world became legends in their own time. They commanded fleets, ruled islands, challenged empires. They built something that approached legitimate power until that power attracted the full attention of Rome, and Rome crushed them utterly. This pattern, too, would repeat. The history of piracy is a history of rise and fall, of bold ascendancy followed by brutal suppression. Pirates flourish, grow arrogant, overreach, and are destroyed. Then, years or decades later, when the circumstances align once more, new pirates emerge to try their luck against the merchants and empires of their age. In the mists of ancient history, in the wine-dark seas Homer sang about, the first sea wolves learned this cycle. They learned that the sea gives both opportunity and doom. They learned that a pirate's life burns bright and brief, like a torch in darkness. They learned that empires might tolerate piracy for years or even decades, but eventually the hammer falls. Julius Caesar understood this from both sides. As a captive, he saw piracy from within the rough camaraderie, the casual violence, the swagger of men who lived outside the law. As a Roman commander, he saw it from above the necessary evil that must be suppressed to maintain civilization, commerce, and order. His life, in some ways, contains the entire story of ancient piracy in miniature. The bold captive becomes the relentless hunter. The victim becomes the avenger. The pirates who mocked him died on crosses, and Caesar went on to conquer Gaul and rule Rome. The ancient terrors of the wine-dark seas set patterns that would echo for thousands of years. They established that piracy was profitable, but ultimately doomed. They proved that organized piracy could threaten even the greatest empires. They showed that the sea, for all its vastness, could be controlled by sufficient force and will. And they left us with questions that remain unanswered. What drives a man to piracy? Is it pure greed or desperation, or a hunger for freedom from the constraints of civilization? When does a pirate become an admiral, a criminal become a king? Where is the line between privateer and pirate, between state-sanctioned violence and outright brigandage? The ancient world could not answer these questions definitively, neither can we. But the stories remain, preserved in fragments of papyrus and carved in stone, telling us that 3,000 years ago the Mediterranean already knew the terror of the black sail on the horizon. They already understood the mathematics of plunder, already felt the eternal tension between the chaos of the sea and the order of the land. The wine-dark seas claimed countless lives. They made some men rich and destroyed others. They tested the limits of human courage and cruelty, and they taught a lesson that every generation must learn anew. The sea gives freedom, but freedom without law becomes tyranny. The pirate's flag means liberty only until the navy's guns restore order. This ancient struggle between pirates and empires, between chaos and civilization, and between the wolf and the shepherd, this is where our story truly begins. For all that followed, all the legendary captains and epic battles and romantic myths can be traced back to these first sea raiders who discovered that the Mediterranean was vast enough to hide in and rich enough to plunder. They were the first. They would not be the last. The thunder from the north was already building, though the ancient world could not yet hear it. In the cold seas beyond Rome's reach, a different kind of sea-wolf was being born, one that would reshape Europe and terrify Christendom for centuries. But that is a story for the next chapter in our journey through the blood-stained annals of maritime history. The ancient terrors taught us the grammar of piracy. The Vikings would teach us its poetry. On the 8th of June, 793, something unprecedented occurred on the island of Lindisfarne off the northeastern coast of England. The monastery there was renowned throughout Christendom, a centre of learning and faith, home to the Lindisfarne Gospels, a place of peace and prayer. The monks believed themselves under God's protection. They were wrong. Ships appeared from the morning mist, not the rounded merchant vessels the monks might have recognized, but something else entirely sleek, predatory craft with high prows carved into snarling dragon heads. Men poured from these ships like wolves from the forest. They carried axes and swords. They showed no mercy. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records the event with horror barely contained. Never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race. The heathens poured out the blood of saints around the altar and trampled on the bodies of saints in the temple of God like dung in the streets. Europe had met the Vikings. Understand what this meant. For centuries, Christendom had grown comfortable, insular, predictable. The old Roman naval power was long gone, replaced by fragmented kingdoms more concerned with land than sea. The Mediterranean had its conflicts, yes, but the northern waters were quiet. Monasteries and towns sat undefended on coasts and riverbanks because there was nothing to defend against. The Vikings changed everything in a single morning. But who were these raiders? Where had they come from? The answer lies in the fjords of Scandinavia, Norway, Denmark, Sweden, lands of harsh winters and limited farmland. These were not primitive savages, despite what terrified monks wrote. They were sophisticated seafarers who had developed a technology that gave them a decisive advantage: the longship. Imagine a vessel 30 meters long, narrow enough to row swiftly, shallow enough to navigate rivers that no other seagoing ship could enter. A ship that could cross the open ocean to reach Iceland or Greenland, yet draw so little water it could beach on any shoreline. A ship that could be rowed against the wind or current, making it independent of weather conditions that trapped other vessels in port. With both a sail and oars, it was faster than anything else on the water. The longship was a revolution in naval architecture, and it made the Viking Age possible. Why did they come? The answer is complex, part necessity, part opportunity, part culture. Scandinavia's population was growing. Farmland was scarce. But there was another factor, one we often overlook. Viking culture celebrated boldness, valued reputation above life itself. A man's worth was measured by his deeds, his courage, his generosity to his followers. A warrior who died in bed died unmourned. A warrior who died in battle with sword in hand went to Valhalla. This was a society that bred sea wolves. The raids began small hit-and-run attacks on isolated monasteries, but success bred ambition. Within decades, Viking fleets numbered in the hundreds of ships. They were no longer raiding, they were invading. They sailed up the Seine to Paris, up the Thames to London. They conquered kingdoms, demanded tribute, settled permanently in lands they had first come to plunder. The legend of Ragnar Lothbrok captures this transformation perfectly. Whether Ragnar was a single historical figure or a composite of several Viking leaders matters less than what his saga represents. According to the tales, Ragnar was a warrior of exceptional skill and ambition. He raided far and wide, England, Ireland, France. He supposedly led an attack on Paris in 845, holding the city for ransom. The story goes that Ragnar was eventually captured by King Aella of Northumbria and thrown into a pit of venomous serpents. As the snakes struck him, Ragnar supposedly sang a death song. How the little pigs would grunt if they knew how the old boar suffers. The little pigs were his sons. Whether this actually happened is debatable. What followed is historical fact. Ragnar's sons, or the warriors claiming to be his sons, assembled a force unprecedented in Viking history. They called it the Great Heathen Army. In 865, this massive fleet arrived in East Anglia. Their goal was not to raid and retreat, but to conquer and hold, to avenge their father, to carve out kingdoms in England. And they succeeded. The Great Heathen Army swept through England like wildfire through dry grass. They conquered Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia. They captured York and made it a Viking city. King Aella was captured and subjected to the Blood Eagle, a ritual execution so brutal that chroniclers could barely describe it. The spine was cut open, the ribs severed and spread, the lungs pulled out to form the shape of wings. Whether this actually occurred or was propaganda designed to terrorize enemies, the message was clear: do not harm a Viking leader and expect to die peacefully. By 870, most of England belonged to the Vikings. Only Wessex in the southwest remained under Anglo-Saxon rule. Its king was a young man named Alfred. The story of Alfred the Great defending Christian England against the pagan horde has been told and retold for more than 1,000 years. What often gets lost is this: Alfred won not through superior force but through adaptation. He built ships to match the Vikings' longships. He fortified towns so they could withstand raids. He organized the army so that troops could respond quickly to attacks. Most importantly, he recognized that the Vikings were not simply raiders to be driven off. They were settlers who could be negotiated with, converted, integrated. The Danelaw, the portion of England under Viking control, became a recognized political entity. Vikings and Saxons lived side by side, traded, intermarried. The fierce warriors who had terrorized Europe settled down to farm and raise families, but they never entirely lost their sea-roving culture. Generation after generation, young Vikings would take to their ships seeking glory and gold. The Viking impact on Europe cannot be overstated. They didn't just raid, they reshaped the continent. They founded Dublin and ruled it as a Norse kingdom for centuries. They settled Iceland and Greenland. They reached North America 500 years before Columbus, establishing brief settlements in what they called Vinland. In the east, Swedish Vikings the Rus travelled down Russian rivers to trade with Byzantium and the Islamic world, founding trading posts that became cities like Novgorod and Kiev. But here is what matters for our story. The Vikings were pirates on an unprecedented scale. They combined the hit-and-run tactics of the ancient Cilicians with a mobility and reach no previous raiders possessed. They could strike anywhere, at any time, with no warning. Church bells that rang to call the faithful to prayer became warning systems. Vikings' approach. The terror they inspired entered deep into European consciousness. And just as one set of sea wolves prowled the northern waters, another was rising in the south. The Mediterranean, that ancient highway of trade and war, had new masters. Following the explosive expansion of Islam in the 7th and 8th centuries, Muslim rulers controlled the North African coast, Sicily, Spain, and much of the eastern Mediterranean. And they discovered, as so many before them had, that the sea offered opportunities for profit through force. The Barbary corsairs began as something almost legitimate privateers commissioned by the Ottoman Empire and North African states to attack Christian shipping. But the line between privateer and pirate has always been thin, and the corsairs crossed it repeatedly. They developed their own strongholds, their own fleets, their own brutal economies built on slavery and ransom. Imagine the life of a Barbary corsair in the 15th or 16th century. You sail from Algiers or Tunis in a swift galley powered by enslaved Christian rowers. You patrol the shipping lanes, seeking merchant vessels or, better yet, raiding the coasts of Spain, Italy, even France. You capture ships, seize cargo, take everyone aboard as captives. Christians of means will be ransomed. Those too poor to ransom become slaves, the men to row galleys or labour in North African cities, the women for harems or households. It was systematic, organised, and terrifyingly effective. The Barbary states built entire economies around this predation. They developed diplomatic relations with European powers, playing nations against each other. Ransom payments became a significant source of revenue for several Mediterranean states. Religious orders were founded specifically to ransom Christian captives from Barbary slavery. The greatest of the Barbary corsairs became legends in their own time, none more so than Hayreddin Barbarossa, Red Beard. Born on the Greek island of Lesbos to a Christian father who converted to Islam, Hayreddin and his brothers started as privateers attacking Christian shipping. But Hayreddin possessed something rare: strategic vision combined with tactical brilliance. He didn't just raid, he built. He seized Algiers and made it a corsair stronghold. He allied with the Ottoman Sultan, accepting official appointment as an admiral while maintaining independence in practice. Barbarossa commanded fleets of hundreds of ships. He fought and won battles against the combined navies of Christian Europe. In 1534 he captured Tunis. In 1538, at the Battle of Preveza, his fleet defeated a Holy League coalition that included Spain, Venice, the Papal States, and the Knights Hospitaller. It was one of the most decisive naval victories of the century, ensuring Ottoman dominance of the eastern Mediterranean for decades. But here is what makes Barbarossa's story remarkable. He died wealthy, powerful, and honoured. He was not hunted down like the pirates of antiquity or executed like so many sea raiders. He retired as the Capudan Pasha Grand Admiral of the Ottoman fleet and died in his bed in Constantinople in 1546. His tomb became a shrine. Ottoman naval officers would visit it to pray for success before important battles. Barbarossa proved something crucial. A pirate could become an admiral. A criminal could become a king if he was bold enough, skilled enough, and allied with sufficient power. This lesson would inspire generations of sea rovers. The conflict between Christian and Muslim fleets transformed the Mediterranean into a battlefield that raged for centuries. This was not merely piracy, it was civilizational warfare carried out through privateering, corsair raids, naval battles, and coastal predation. Each side claimed religious justification. Each side enslaved the other. Each side built fortifications and organized convoys and hunted enemy ships with equal determination. The Knights of Malta, successors to the Knights Hospitaller, made themselves the Christian equivalent of the Barbary corsairs. From their island fortress they raided Muslim shipping, enslaved Muslim captives, and presented themselves as holy warriors defending Christendom. The knights accumulated enormous wealth through their predation. Their grand masters lived like kings. Their fortress in Valletta became one of the most formidable defensive works in Europe. When the Ottomans besieged Malta in 1565, it was one of the great confrontations of the age. 40,000 Ottoman troops and sailors against a defending force of perhaps 6,000 knights and Maltese militia. The siege lasted 4 months. The Ottomans hurled everything they had at the fortress. They came within a hair's breadth of victory. But the knights held, and when Spanish reinforcements finally arrived, the Ottoman force withdrew in defeat. The Great Siege of Malta passed into legend as Christian Europe's great defensive victory against Islam. But look beneath the religious rhetoric and you see something else. Pirates. Fighting. Pirates. The Knights of Malta were corsairs with better public relations. They enslaved Muslim captives just as the Barbary corsairs enslaved Christians. They raided for profit just as eagerly. The difference was simply which religion they claimed to serve. This is what medieval piracy became in the Mediterranean, a perpetual war justified by faith, prosecuted for profit, and sustained by the simple fact that both sides found it economically viable. Slaves rode the galleys, ransom payments enriched the states, captured cargo funded further raids. It was a brutal equilibrium that persisted for centuries. Meanwhile, in the north, the Viking Age was gradually ending not through military defeat but through cultural transformation. Vikings converted to Christianity. They settled into kingdoms. The raiders became farmers, traders, craftsmen. The longship technology spread, but the culture that drove young men to raid for glory faded. By the 12th century, the great age of Viking piracy was over, but its impact remained. The Normans who conquered England in 1066 were Vikings who had settled in France. The kingdoms of Dublin, York, and countless other cities bore Viking marks. The English language absorbed hundreds of Norse words. The very concept of exploration and seafaring adventure was shaped by Viking example, and the Vikings left one more legacy, the archetype of the pirate as adventurer. Yes, they were brutal. Yes, they terrorized innocents. But they were also bold beyond measure, curious about the world, willing to sail beyond every horizon. They were not merely criminals, they were explorers, traders, settlers, poets. Their sagas celebrate not just warfare, but also wit, loyalty, and a fatalistic courage that accepted death without flinching. This complexity pirate as both monster and hero would echo through all subsequent pirate mythology. The medieval period showed that piracy could operate on civilizational scales. The Vikings reshaped Europe. The Barbary corsairs built states. Individual pirate leaders became admirals and kings. But it also showed that piracy remained tied to specific circumstances. Vikings raided because their longship technology gave them mobility no one else possessed, and because their culture valued the warrior's path. Barbary corsairs flourished because the religious divide between Christian and Muslim Europe created legal frameworks for predation, and because North African states found it profitable. When those circumstances changed, the piracy changed too. The Vikings settled and converted. The Barbary corsairs would persist for centuries more, but their great age was passing. The Mediterranean was becoming too well policed, too organized for the freewheeling corsair empires of earlier eras. But even as one age of piracy waned, another was beginning. Far to the west, across the Atlantic, a new world had been discovered, and that new world was producing wealth beyond imagination, mountains of silver and gold, flowing from the Americas to Spain in treasure fleets that became the most tempting targets in maritime history. The stage was set for piracy's golden age. The Caribbean was about to become the most dangerous and most profitable hunting ground the world had ever seen. The sea wolves were gathering, drawn by the scent of Spanish gold. The medieval scourge had taught important lessons. It showed that pirates could build institutions, create cultures, challenge empires. It demonstrated that piracy flourished at the intersection of technology, opportunity, and cultural acceptance. It proved that today's pirate could be tomorrow's admiral if the circumstances aligned. These lessons would not be forgotten. When English, French, and Dutch sea rovers began prowling the Caribbean, they would remember Barbarossa's rise to power and the Vikings' legendary boldness. They would understand that piracy was not merely theft, it was a form of warfare, a means of building wealth and reputation, a path from poverty to power. The thunder from the north had faded to distant echoes, but a new storm was brewing in the west, and it would be the greatest tempest of all. In 1519, Hernán Cortés stood before the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan and saw something that defied belief. A city larger than any in Spain, built on an island in a vast lake, connected to the shore by great causeways, temples that gleamed white in the sun, markets where tens of thousands traded goods from across an empire, and everywhere in the temples, in the emperor's palace, adorning the noble's gold. 2 years later, Tenochtitlan lay in ruins, and the gold belonged to Spain. A decade after that, Francisco Pizarro would do the same to the Inca Empire in Peru. He would capture the Inca emperor Atahualpa and demand a ransom, a room 22 feet long and 17 feet wide, filled with gold artifacts to a height of 8 feet, plus twice that much in silver. Atahualpa fulfilled the ransom. Pizarro had him strangled, anyway, and took the gold. These were not isolated treasures. The Spanish conquistadors had discovered entire civilizations built on precious metals. The silver mines of Potosí in present-day Bolivia would produce more than 60,000 tons of silver over the next 3 centuries. The gold of Mexico and Colombia flowed in quantities that beg a description. All of it was destined for Spain. Consider what this meant. Every year, fleets of Spanish galleons would assemble in the Caribbean ports of Nombre de Dios, Cartagena, Veracruz, and Portobello. They would load their holds with treasure chests of gold doubloons, bars of silver, emeralds from Colombia, pearls from the Caribbean. Then they would sail in convoy across the Atlantic to Seville, bringing wealth that transformed Spain into the greatest power in Europe. The treasure fleets were the richest prizes that had ever sailed the seas, and every pirate, privateer, and sea rover in the Atlantic knew it. But we must be precise about terms. The men who hunted Spanish treasure were not all the same. Some were pirates, outlaws who attacked any ship regardless of nationality. Some were privateers, sailors who held letters of marque from their governments, legal authorization to attack enemy shipping in time of war. Some were buccaneers, a rough fraternity who started as hunters and smugglers before turning to piracy. The lines between these categories were always blurred. A privateer whose letter of marque expired might simply continue raiding without authorization. A pirate who served his nation's interests might receive a pardon and a knighthood. The sea was far from any court, and out on the water, force mattered more than paperwork. The first great English sea rover was Francis Drake, and his story illustrates perfectly the ambiguity of this age. Drake was born around 1540, the son of a farmer turned preacher. He went to sea young, starting as an apprentice on trading vessels. By his 20s, he was making voyages to the Spanish Main, that Caribbean coastline controlled by Spain, and here he learned a bitter lesson. Spain claimed absolute monopoly over the New World. English ships attempting to trade were attacked, captured, their crews imprisoned or killed. In 1568, Drake sailed with his cousin John Hawkins on a trading expedition that included a cargo of enslaved Africans, a trade the Spanish themselves practiced, but claimed exclusive rights to. At San Juan de Ulua in Mexico, a Spanish fleet attacked without warning. Drake and Hawkins barely escaped with their lives. Most of their men died or were captured. Those captured faced the Inquisition. Drake never forgave Spain. For the rest of his life he would be Spain's nemesis. In 1572, Drake led a small expedition to the Isthmus of Panama with the audacious goal to raid Nombre de Dios, the treasure port where Peruvian silver was gathered before being shipped to Spain. He allied with escaped African slaves called Cimarrons, who had their own grievances against Spain. Together, they attacked Nombre de Dios directly. The raid was chaos. Drake was wounded in the first assault. His men retreated, but Drake had seen something that changed his life. The king's treasure house, its doors open, stacks of silver bars piled to the ceiling, 70 tons of silver just sitting there. Drake returned with a different plan. Instead of attacking the fortified port, he would ambush the treasure as it crossed the isthmus from Panama to Nombre de Dios. In a carefully planned raid, his men captured a mule train carrying 30 tons of silver and gold. It was more wealth than Drake had imagined possible. He returned to England a rich man, but he wanted more. He wanted to do something no Englishman had ever done. He wanted to sail around the world. In 1577, Drake left Plymouth with 5 ships. Officially, he was on a trading voyage. In reality, he carried secret instructions from Queen Elizabeth herself: raid Spanish possessions in the Pacific, where no English ship had ever sailed. The Pacific was Spain's private ocean. Spanish ships sailed there unarmed, never expecting attack. Drake meant to change that. The voyage was an epic of navigation and audacity. Drake sailed down the coast of South America, through the treacherous Strait of Magellan. Storms scattered his fleet. Ships turned back or were lost. Drake continued with just his flagship, the Golden Hind, and a crew of perhaps 80 men. They emerged into the Pacific and began raiding up the coast of Chile and Peru. Spanish ships and ports were utterly unprepared. Drake captured vessel after vessel, taking on treasure and supplies. Near Lima, he seized a ship called Nuestra Señora de la Concepción, so heavily laden with treasure that the Spanish called her Cacafuego, fire shitter. Drake took 26 tons of silver from her hold, along with chests of gold and precious stones. He continued north to California, which he claimed for England, calling it Nova Albion. Then he turned west, across the Pacific. He sailed across the Indian Ocean, around the Cape of Good Hope, and finally back to Plymouth in September 1580. He had circumnavigated the globe. His ship's hold was filled with treasure worth more than the English crown's annual revenue. Spain demanded Drake be executed as a pirate. Queen Elizabeth's response was to knight him aboard the Golden Hind. Sir Francis Drake became a national hero, celebrated throughout England and feared throughout the Spanish Empire. Here is what Drake's voyage demonstrated. Spain's monopoly was an illusion. Spanish America was vulnerable. The treasure could be taken, and England would not be bound by Spanish claims to exclusive dominion over the New World. Drake's success inspired a generation of English sea rovers, men like Thomas Cavendish, who also circumnavigated the globe, raiding Spanish shipping along the way. Christopher Newport, who raided the Caribbean repeatedly. Martin Frobisher, who combined piracy with attempts to find the Northwest Passage. But Drake remained the exemplar. When the Spanish Armada sailed to invade England in 1588, Drake was Vice Admiral of the English fleet that destroyed it. He died in 1596, attempting one last raid on the Spanish Main. Even in death, he was buried at sea in a lead coffin off the coast of Portobello, forever present in the waters where he had made his name. Drake blurred every line. Was he a pirate? By Spanish law, absolutely. Was he a privateer? Sometimes he held letters of marque during some voyages. Was he an explorer? Undeniably. Was he a national hero? To England, certainly. To Spain, he was nothing less than a devil incarnate, El Drac, the dragon. This ambiguity characterized the age, because while England and Spain were not always formally at war, they were certainly not at peace. Drake and men like him operated in a grey zone where theft was patriotism and piracy was policy. The French had their own sea rovers. François Leclerc, called Jambe de Bois, wooden leg, who raided Spanish ports with a fleet of 10 ships. Jacques de Sores, who captured and burned Havana itself in 1555, shocking Spain with the vulnerability of even major colonial cities. But perhaps the most successful French privateer was Michel de Grammont. In 1678, he led a fleet of 6 ships to Venezuela and captured the city of Maracaibo, holding it for ransom. The Spanish paid. In 1683, he raided the same region again, taking even more treasure. De Grammont understood something crucial. Spanish colonial cities were rich, often poorly defended, and could be ransomed rather than simply looted. A captured city could be milked for far more treasure than a captured ship. The Dutch entered the game later, but with characteristic efficiency. The Dutch West India Company was founded in 1621 with an explicit mission: attack Spanish and Portuguese shipping and colonies in the Americas. It was privateering as corporate enterprise. The company's most famous success came in 1628, when Admiral Piet Hein captured the entire Spanish treasure fleet off Cuba, 31 ships carrying 11 million guilders worth of treasure. It was the single greatest pirate heist in history, and it helped fund the Dutch War of Independence from Spain. These were not lone raiders. These were fleets, organized expeditions, quasi-military operations. They were piracy elevated to the level of state policy, privateering as economic warfare. And they were phenomenally successful because Spain's empire was simply too vast to defend adequately. Consider the logistics. Spanish treasure had to be gathered from mines in Mexico, Peru, and Bolivia. It had to be transported overland to Caribbean ports. It had to be loaded onto ships and sailed through waters where enemies lurked. It had to cross the Atlantic weeks of sailing where storms, disease, or attack could end the voyage. All of this under constant threat. Spain responded by developing the fleet system. Galleons would sail in convoy, heavily armed and protected by warships. They would gather at Havana and sail together through the Florida Straits, where the Gulf Stream provided favorable currents. They would stay together across the Atlantic, making them a less vulnerable target than isolated ships. The system worked, mostly. Most treasure fleets reached Spain safely, but the ones that didn't through storm, shipwreck, or pirate attack, those created legends and inspired hope in every sea rover that fortune might favor the bold. The Spanish also fortified their colonial ports. Cartagena, Portobello, Veracruz, Havana, all became fortress cities, with massive stone walls and powerful batteries of cannon. The fortifications were impressive. San Juan in Puerto Rico, Cartagena in Colombia, these places became nearly impregnable to direct assault. But here is what the pirates discovered. You didn't need to attack the fortresses. You could raid the undefended coastline between them. You could capture ships sailing to and from the ports. You could ambush treasure as it moved overland. The Spanish Empire had thousands of miles of coastline and couldn't possibly defend it all. And there was another approach, one that would shape the future of Caribbean piracy: become a buccaneer. The word buccaneer comes from bucan, a wooden frame used to smoke meat. The first buccaneers were not pirates at all. They were hunters on the island of Hispaniola, present-day Haiti and the Dominican Republic. They lived rough, hunting wild cattle and pigs descended from Spanish stock, smoking the meat and selling it to passing ships. They were tough, independent, and completely outside Spanish authority, Spain tried to drive them out. The response was predictable. The buccaneers turned to piracy. If Spain wouldn't let them hunt peacefully, they would hunt Spanish ships instead. They developed their own society, their own codes, their own gathering places. Tortuga, a small island off the north coast of Hispaniola, became their headquarters. It was defensible, close to shipping lanes, and outside Spanish control. French governors claimed it, but the buccaneers governed themselves. These early buccaneers established patterns that would define Caribbean piracy for decades. They were democratic crews, elected their captains and quartermasters. They were organized, they had written codes governing conduct and dividing treasure. They were effective, they combined seamanship with marksmanship and utter fearlessness in combat. One of the most remarkable early buccaneer leaders was a Frenchman known to history only as Alexandre Exquemelin, though he is better known as the author of The Buccaneers of America, published in 1678. His book provides our most detailed eyewitness account of buccaneer life, and what an account it is. Exquemelin describes raids on Spanish towns where buccaneers outnumbered and outgunned nevertheless triumphed through audacity and intimate knowledge of the terrain. He describes the division of plunder according to strict rules. The captain received 5 or 6 shares, specialists like the surgeon received extra portions, men who lost limbs in battle received compensation from the common fund. Crews would sign articles before each voyage, spelling out everyone's rights and obligations. This was not lawless chaos. This was organization, democracy in action, a rough kind of justice that contrasted sharply with the rigid hierarchies of naval and merchant ships. The most famous of all buccaneers was Henry Morgan, and his story shows how a pirate could become respectable, how an outlaw could become a knight. Morgan was born in Wales around 1635. He reached the Caribbean in his 20s, possibly as an indentured servant, possibly as a soldier. By the 1660s, he was leading buccaneer expeditions, and he thought big. In 1668, Morgan led 500 buccaneers in an attack on Portobello, one of Spain's most important treasure ports. The fortifications were formidable, 3 forts with hundreds of soldiers. Morgan attacked at night, took the fortifications in brutal hand-to-hand fighting, and captured the city. He held Portobello for ransom, extracting 100,000 pieces of 8 before withdrawing. 2 years later, he topped himself. He led a fleet of 36 ships and 2,000 men, the largest buccaneer force ever assembled across the Isthmus of Panama to attack Panama City itself. The Spanish had never imagined anyone would attack from the Pacific side. Morgan's men marched through jungle, fought off Spanish counterattacks, and stormed the city. Panama City burned. Morgan returned with vast quantities of treasure. It was piracy on an unprecedented scale. Spain was outraged, demanding Morgan's arrest and execution. England's response? In 1674, Morgan was knighted and appointed Deputy Governor of Jamaica. Sir Henry Morgan spent his later years hunting the very pirates he had once led, dying wealthy and respected in 1688. Morgan's success demonstrated something crucial. In the rivalry between European powers, today's pirate could be tomorrow's governor. Privateering blurred into piracy, which blurred back into respectability. The game was not about law, it was about power, profit, and political utility. By the late 1600s, the Caribbean had become the most pirate-infested waters in the world. Spanish treasure continued to flow. English, French, and Dutch colonies provided bases and markets. Buccaneers prowled the shipping lanes, and a city emerged that would become legendary as the wickedest place on earth. Port Royal, Jamaica. Port Royal sat on a spit of land forming one side of Kingston Harbour. It had the perfect natural harbour, deep, protected, accessible. English authorities officially disapproved of piracy, but they welcomed pirate gold. Port Royal became rich beyond measure. Merchants grew wealthy buying plundered goods. Taverns and brothels multiplied. It was said you could find anything in Port Royal, from the finest wines of Europe to enslaved people from Africa to treasure plundered from Spanish churches. The pirates who used Port Royal as their base were becoming legends. Names that would echo through history were making their reputations. Captain William Kidd, Charles Vane, Jack Rackham. But we're getting ahead of our story. Their time, the golden age of piracy proper, was still to come. First would come a reckoning. On June 7th, 1692, at 11:43 in the morning, an earthquake struck Jamaica. Port Royal, built on unstable sand and coral, liquefied. 2/3 of the city slid into the sea. 2,000 people died in minutes. The survivors saw it as God's judgment on their wickedness. Port Royal would be rebuilt, but it would never regain its former glory. The age of the buccaneers was ending. Spain's treasure fleets were now too well protected, too organized, for the freewheeling raids that had worked in earlier decades. The European powers were professionalizing their navies and cracking down on privateering. The buccaneers were becoming an embarrassment rather than an asset. But the pirates were not done. Not nearly. They had learned too much, gained too much, tasted too much freedom to simply return to normal life. The golden dawn of the Spanish treasure fleets had made piracy profitable beyond dreams. It had created a generation of sea rovers who knew that fortune favored the bold. The stage was being set for piracy's greatest act, an era when pirates would create their own republic, write their own laws, and briefly seem unstoppable. The treasure fleets had been training grounds. The buccaneers had established the codes and cultures. Now would come the golden age proper, when the black flag would strike terror across the Atlantic, when legendary captains would become household names, and when for one brief, glorious, doomed moment, the pirates would seem to rule the seas. The Spanish treasure had been the lure. The next chapter would show what happened when the hunters became a brotherhood, when piracy became a society, when desperate men glimpsed the possibility of freedom and reached for it with both hands. In 1715, the island of New Providence in the Bahamas was home to perhaps 3,000 people. 1,000 were pirates. The rest served them, traded with them, or tried to avoid them. There was no effective government, no law beyond what the pirate captains enforced, no authority but the gun and the cutlass. And for a brief, remarkable moment, it worked. Nassau, the settlement on New Providence, had become something unprecedented, a pirate republic, a place where crews elected their captains democratically, where plunder was divided by written articles, where a sailor fleeing the brutal hierarchy of merchant ships or naval vessels could find something approaching freedom. It was an experiment in radical democracy, and it terrified the civilized world. Understand what this meant. On Royal Navy ships, captains were tyrants by law. They could flog sailors for minor infractions. Food was often rotting, water brackish. Discipline was maintained through fear and violence. Merchant ships were little better captains, owned by wealthy merchants who cared only for profit, working their crews to exhaustion for miserable wages. But on a pirate ship, the captain was elected and could be removed by vote. The quartermaster, also elected, represented the crew's interests, controlled the distribution of plunder, and could overrule the captain in all matters except combat. Before each voyage, the crew signed articles spelling out everyone's share, compensation for injuries, and rules of conduct. Every man had a vote in major decisions. It was not paradise. It was violent, chaotic, often brutal. But to a sailor who had known only rigid hierarchy and arbitrary punishment, it must have felt like liberation. This is why piracy flourished in the early 1700s. It offered something the legitimate world did not: a voice, a share, a chance. And thousands of sailors chose that chance, despite knowing the gallows waited at journey's end. The pirate Republic of Nassau produced legends, names that still resonate 3 centuries later, and none more so than Edward Teach, better known as Blackbeard. We know surprisingly little about Teach's early life. He was likely born in Bristol, England, around 1680. He went to sea young, probably serving on privateers during the War of Spanish Succession. When the war ended in 1713, thousands of privateers found themselves unemployed. Many turned to piracy. Teach was among them. By 1716, Teach was serving under Benjamin Hornigold, one of Nassau's most successful pirate captains. Teach learned quickly. Within a year, Hornigold promoted him to command of a captured sloop. In 1717, they captured a French slave ship, La Concorde, mounting 40 guns. Hornigold gave the ship to Teach, who renamed her Queen Anne's Revenge and made her his flagship. Teach understood something crucial about piracy. Reputation was everything. If merchant ships surrendered without a fight, there was no need for bloodshed and no damage to the captured vessel or cargo. But they would only surrender if they believed resistance was futile and death was certain. So Teach created Blackbeard. He grew his beard long and wild, tying it with ribbons. Before battle, he would tuck slow-burning fuses under his hat and behind his ears, wreathing his face in smoke. He dressed in dark clothing, carried multiple pistols on crossed bandoliers, wore a massive cutlass. He cultivated a reputation for inhuman ferocity. Stories spread, probably encouraged by Teach himself, that he was the devil incarnate, that he drank rum mixed with gunpowder, that he had murdered his own wives. Most of these stories were likely exaggerated or invented, but they worked. When Queen Anne's Revenge appeared, flying the black flag, ships often surrendered immediately. Blackbeard's reputation did the work of 100 cannon. In May 1718, Blackbeard achieved his most audacious act. He sailed into Charleston Harbor, South Carolina, one of the most important ports in British America, with a squadron of 4 ships. He blockaded the harbor for nearly a week, capturing 8 or 9 vessels. He sent a message to the governor: provide a chest of medicine, or Blackbeard would send the heads of his hostages to the governor and burn every captured ship. Charleston complied. Blackbeard got his medicine, released the hostages, and sailed away. He had held an entire colonial city hostage, and there was nothing the authorities could do about it. This was the golden age at its peak. Pirates so powerful they could challenge colonial governments, so bold they seemed unstoppable. But Blackbeard was only one among many legendary captains prowling the Atlantic in these years. Each brought their own style to piracy. Bartholomew Roberts' Black Bart was perhaps the most successful pirate of the age, capturing more than 400 vessels in his career. Roberts came to piracy almost by accident. He was a mate on a slave ship captured by pirates in 1719. The pirate captain was killed shortly after, and the crew elected Roberts as replacement. He was 37 years old, older than most pirate captains, a sober man who preferred tea to rum. Roberts brought a sense of professionalism to piracy. He was a skilled navigator and tactician. He maintained strict discipline. His articles banned gambling and forbade women aboard ship. He dressed magnificently for battle, wearing rich coats of red damask, feathered hats, jeweled crosses. He wanted his victims to know they faced a gentleman, not a common criminal. Roberts raided from Brazil to Newfoundland, from the Caribbean to West Africa. He was audacious beyond measure, once sailing into a Portuguese harbour and capturing a fleet of 42 vessels at anchor. His black flags carried ominous imagery, himself standing on 2 skulls marked ABH and AMH, a Barbadian head and a Martinican head, revenge for hostile treatment from those islands. Roberts understood the game. He once said, "In an honest service there is thin commons, low wages, and hard labour. In piracy there is plenty and satiety, pleasure and ease, liberty and power, a merry life, and a short one shall be my motto." he got his wish. In 1722, HMS Swallow caught Roberts off the African coast. In the battle that followed, grape shot struck Roberts in the throat. He died instantly. His crew threw his body overboard, weighted with chains, so his enemies could not display it. Black Bart was gone, but his legend endured. Then there was Calico Jack Rackham, remembered less for his success. He was not particularly successful than for his crew, which included two of history's most famous female pirates. Anne Bonny was born in Ireland around 17, the illegitimate daughter of a lawyer and his servant. Her father fled to Carolina, taking Anne and her mother with him. Anne grew up wild, allegedly stabbing a servant who tried to assault her. She married a poor sailor named James Bonny, who took her to Nassau. There she met Jack Rackham, who was everything her husband was, not charismatic, successful, or romantic. She left Bonny and joined Rackham's crew, disguised as a man. Pirates had strict rules against bringing women aboard, believing it caused jealousy and disorder. Anne hid her identity until she proved herself in combat. Aboard Rackham's ship, Anne met Mary Read, another woman disguised as a male pirate. Read's story was even more remarkable. Born in England, raised as a boy to qualify for an inheritance, she had served as a soldier in the War of Spanish Succession. She married a fellow soldier, briefly ran an inn, then returned to disguise when her husband died. She took passage on a ship that was captured by pirates. She joined the pirate crew and eventually connected with Rackham and Bonny, two women pirates, both disguised as men, both serving on the same ship. When their secret was revealed to the crew, Rackham let them stay. They had proven themselves fierce fighters. Anne and Mary became lovers, according to some accounts, or close friends according to others. The historical record is frustratingly vague. What we know for certain is this. In October 1720, a pirate hunter named Captain Barnett caught Rackham's ship off Jamaica. Most of Rackham's crew was drunk below decks. Only Anne Bonny and Mary Read fought back, cursing their shipmates for cowards. They were all captured. At trial, Rackham and the male crew members were sentenced to hang. When Rackham was allowed to see Anne before his execution, she showed no sympathy. "Had you fought like a man, you need not have been hanged like a dog." Anne and Mary escaped the noose by pleading their bellies. Both were pregnant. Mary died of fever in prison. Anne's fate is unknown. Her wealthy father may have bought her freedom, or she may have died in prison. She simply vanishes from the historical record, leaving us with tantalizing questions about her fate. The story of Anne Bonny and Mary Read captured imaginations for a reason. They demonstrated that piracy's appeal transcended gender. The freedom, the equality, the chance to fight and claim your share, these drew women as well as men to the black flag. In a world that offered women few choices and less freedom, piracy represented a radical alternative. Another captain who exemplifies the strangeness of the pirate republic was Stede Bonnet, the gentleman pirate. Bonnet was born to wealth in Barbados. He was educated, well-read, a major in the militia, owner of a prosperous plantation. He had every reason to live a comfortable, respectable life. Instead, in 1717, he bought a ship, hired a crew, and turned pirate. Why? According to contemporary accounts, he had a disorder of his mind, brought on by some discomforts he found in a married state. In other words, to escape his wife. It seems absurd abandoning wealth and status for piracy because of marital problems. But perhaps Bonnet was seeking something his comfortable life could not provide. Adventure, freedom, meaning. Bonnet was hopeless as a pirate captain. He knew nothing about sailing or ship handling. His crew had to navigate while he gave orders he barely understood. Early encounters with other ships were disasters. Then Bonnet met Blackbeard, who essentially took over Bonnet's ship while allowing him to save face. Eventually, Bonnet struck out on his own again, enjoying some success raiding along the American coast. But in 1718, the pirate hunter Colonel William Rhett trapped Bonnet in the Cape Fear River. After a fierce battle, Bonnet surrendered. At trial, Bonnet pleaded for mercy, arguing that he had been coerced by Blackbeard. The court was unmoved. Stede Bonnet was hanged in Charleston in November 1718. His execution demonstrated that wealth and education provided no protection from the noose. The law made no distinction between the gentleman pirate and the common sailor when both flew the black flag. These captains, Blackbeard, Roberts, Rackham, Bonney, Reed, Bonnet, were the celebrities of their age. Their exploits were reported in newspapers throughout the Atlantic world. They were simultaneously feared and admired, condemned and secretly celebrated. They represented a life lived on one's own terms, free from authority, bound by codes of their own making. But what was life actually like in the Pirate Republic of Nassau? We have detailed accounts from the period that paint a vivid picture. Nassau had no proper buildings, mostly tents and ramshackle huts. The streets, such as they were, ran with rum and sewage. Discipline was maintained by rough justice pirates who broke the code faced marooning or execution by vote of their crew. There were no courts, no police, no government beyond what the pirate captains collectively enforced. And yet, there was order of a sort. Captured goods were brought to Nassau and sold, often to merchants from the American colonies, who had no scruples about buying plunder. The money flowed freely. Pirates fresh from a successful cruise would spend months drinking, gambling, and whoring until their share was gone, then sign up for another voyage. Women were present in Nassau, prostitutes, traders, wives, and lovers of pirates. Some were there voluntarily, some had been captured and stayed by choice or necessity. It was a hard place for anyone, but particularly for women in a society of violent men. The pirate codes varied from ship to ship, but common elements appear across multiple accounts. Lights and candles were to be extinguished by 8 in the evening. Fire was a deadly danger on wooden ships. No gambling aboard ship, no women or boys. This rule was frequently broken, but existed to prevent jealousy and fights. Each man had a vote in important affairs and equal share of provisions. Musicians had Sundays off, a detail that somehow makes these fierce pirates more human. Compensation for injuries was spelled out precisely. Loss of a right arm, 600 pieces of 8. Left arm, 500. Right leg, 500. Left leg, 400. An eye or finger, 100. These rates varied between ships, but the principle was universal. The crew took care of its own. Punishment for breaking the code was severe. Theft from fellow pirates was often punished by marooning, being left on a deserted island with a bottle of water, a pistol with 1 shot, and nothing else. A pirate marooned knew he faced death, and the pistol was a mercy, allowing him to choose the manner of his end. Murder of a fellow pirate could mean death or marooning. Desertion in battle meant the same. Rape of a captive woman was punishable by death on some ships, not from any particular respect for women, but because it caused disorder and might provoke captives to resist violently. The democracy of pirate ships was real but limited. Captains had absolute authority during combat. The quartermaster controlled everything else, but both could be removed by vote if the crew was dissatisfied. This created a strange dynamic. Captains had to be fierce enough to command respect, but fair enough to retain loyalty. It was leadership by consent, which contrasted sharply with the absolute authority of naval and merchant captains. The black flag itself carried meaning. A plain black flag meant no quarter given, surrender or die. Some captains used red flags for the same purpose. Many pirates designed personalized flags. Blackbeard's showed a skeleton spearing a heart while toasting the devil. Robert's flags depicted him standing on skulls. The skull and crossbones, the Jolly Roger, became iconic. though many variations existed. The flag was psychological warfare. Raising the black flag gave merchant ships a chance to surrender peacefully. If they did, pirates would typically take cargo but spare the ship and crew. If they resisted, no mercy would be shown. This was rational. From the pirates' perspective, it encouraged surrender and reduced the danger to themselves. Nassau's golden age lasted only a few years. From 1715 to 1718, it was the undisputed capital of piracy, but it could not last. The Pirate Republic had one fatal weakness. It existed in defiance of every European power. England, France, Spain, all wanted it destroyed, and eventually they would send the force necessary to destroy it. But before the end came, Nassau produced one more legend, one more figure who embodied both the glory and the doom of the pirate age. Charles Vane was perhaps the most uncompromising of all the Nassau pirates. While others sometimes showed mercy or operated with some restraint, Vane was notorious for cruelty. He tortured prisoners to extract information about hidden treasures. He burned ships that had surrendered. He showed no mercy and expected none in return. Vane understood that compromise was death. He refused pardons, scorned offers of amnesty, declared openly that he would never submit to any authority but his own. When Woodes Rogers arrived in Nassau as the new royal governor, with pardons for pirates who would surrender, many captains accepted. Hornigold took a pardon and became a pirate hunter. Others did the same. Vane sailed out of Nassau harbour, guns blazing, a fireship aimed at Rogers's fleet. He escaped and continued raiding, his black flag a defiant rejection of authority. He represented piracy in its purest form, violent, uncompromising, free. But freedom is not the same as invincibility. In 1718, Vane encountered a French man of war that was more than his ship could handle. He wisely decided to flee rather than fight. His crew, disappointed at missing plunder, voted him out as captain. Jack Rackham replaced him. Vane was given a small sloop and continued pirating with a handful of loyal men. In 1720, Vane's ship was wrecked in a hurricane. He survived, but was marooned on a deserted island. Months later, a ship arrived captained by a former friend. The captain refused to rescue Vane, saying, "I will not trust you aboard my ship, for I shall have you plotting with my men, knocking me on the head, and running away with my ship pirating." Eventually, another ship rescued Vane, but he was recognized and turned over to authorities in Jamaica. At trial, he showed no remorse. He was hanged in March 1721, his body left in chains at Gallows Point as a warning to other pirates. The Republic of Pirates was a dream, and like all dreams, it could not survive contact with reality. It offered freedom, but freedom built on theft and violence. It offered democracy, but democracy among outlaws who had declared war on the entire world. It offered equality, but equality in a life that was brutal, dangerous, and short. For a brief moment, Nassau showed that another way was possible, that sailors could govern themselves. That rigid hierarchy was not the only model for society. That desperate men could build something approaching justice, even if imperfect, even if doomed. But the empires were not going to allow a pirate republic to exist. The hunters were coming, with warships and pardons and nooses. The Golden Age was about to become an age of blood and iron. The black flags would fall, one by one. The legendary captains would die on the gallows or in battle. The Republic of Pirates would be swept away like footprints on a beach. But first would come the reckoning, the final battles, the last stands, the desperate defiance of men who had glimpsed freedom and refused to surrender it without a fight. The hunters were becoming the hunted, and the end would be violent and spectacular and utterly merciless. In July 1718, a man named Woodes Rogers sailed into Nassau harbour with 7 ships carrying 100 troops. He was the newly appointed royal governor of the Bahamas, and he carried with him two things that would transform the pirate republic: the king's pardon and the king's justice. Rogers understood pirates better than most officials. He had been a privateer captain himself, commanding a successful circumnavigation and raid on Spanish colonies. He knew the sea, knew sailors, knew what drove men to piracy, and he knew that pure force would not be enough. The pardon offered a way out: surrender, accept amnesty, and return to lawful society without facing the noose. Many pirates accepted. They were tired, or scared, or simply realistic enough to see that the golden age was ending. Benjamin Hornigold, who had taught Blackbeard, took the pardon and became Rogers' chief pirate hunter. Others did the same. It was a brilliant strategy. Who better to catch pirates than former pirates who knew their haunts and tactics? But not everyone surrendered. Charles Vane sailed out of Nassau Harbour in defiance, and others followed. They would not submit. They would rather die free than live as subjects. Rogers was patient and implacable. He fortified Nassau, built proper defences, established law and order. Pirates who returned to Nassau seeking refuge found themselves arrested and tried. The pirate republic was over. In its place stood British authority, backed by naval power. The transformation of Nassau marked a turning point. For the first time, the pirates had nowhere safe to gather. No port would welcome them openly. Colonial governors, once willing to look the other way when pirate gold lubricated commerce, now faced pressure from London to suppress piracy entirely. The economic calculation had changed. Legitimate trade had grown more valuable than plundered goods, and piracy threatened that trade. The British Empire was done tolerating pirates. The manhunt had begun. Blackbeard sensed the changing winds. After his blockade of Charleston, he sailed to North Carolina, where the governor, Charles Eden, was rumoured to be sympathetic to pirates. Blackbeard may have received a pardon. The historical record is unclear. He settled in Bath, attempting to retire on his plunder, but Blackbeard could not resist the sea. He returned to piracy, taking smaller prizes along the North Carolina coast. The governor of Virginia, Alexander Spotswood, decided to act. He could not legally operate in North Carolina waters, but he did not care about legal niceties. He sent two small sloops, commanded by Lieutenant Robert Maynard of the Royal Navy, with orders, find Blackbeard and kill him. On November 22nd, 1718, Maynard found Blackbeard's ship, Adventure, anchored in Ocracoke Inlet. Blackbeard had only 19 men with him, a skeleton crew. Maynard had 54 sailors and marines, but Blackbeard had cannons and intimate knowledge of the shallow waters. The battle began at dawn. Blackbeard's guns raked Maynard's leading sloop, killing and wounding many. But Maynard pressed forward, his ships grounded on sandbars. Blackbeard manoeuvred to rake them again. Then, with brilliant tactical thinking, Maynard ordered most of his men below decks, making his sloop appear helpless and lightly manned. Blackbeard took the bait. He came alongside to board, bringing his crew across. Maynard's hidden men poured onto the deck. The battle became a desperate melee, cutlasses against axes, pistols fired at point-blank range, blood slicking the deck. Blackbeard and Maynard fought face to face. Blackbeard was wounded multiple times, shot 5 times, cut with a sword more than 20 times, but he fought on, a Titan refusing to fall. Finally, a sailor came behind him and nearly severed his head. Blackbeard fell. The battle was over. Maynard severed Blackbeard's head completely and hung it from the bowsprit of his ship. He threw the body overboard. According to legend, the headless corpse swam around the ship 3 times before sinking, a final display of the vitality that had made Blackbeard legendary. The head was brought to Virginia and placed on a pike at the entrance to the Hampton River, where it remained for years a warning to anyone who might consider piracy. Blackbeard's death was symbolic. the most famous pirate of the age, had been hunted down and killed by a naval officer who had violated colonial boundaries to do it. The message was clear. There was nowhere to hide, no authority that would protect pirates, no safety anywhere. But Bartholomew Roberts was still at large, and he was not intimidated. Roberts continued his spectacular career after Blackbeard's death, taking prize after prize from Brazil to Africa to the Caribbean. He seemed unstoppable, clever, audacious, always one step ahead of pursuing naval vessels. He developed a reputation for treating captured crews well if they surrendered, but showing no mercy to those who resisted. He would often force musicians from captured ships to join his crew, creating a pirate band that played during raids. The Royal Navy assigned Captain Challoner Ogle of HMS Swallow to hunt Roberts specifically. Ogle was methodical, patient, determined. He tracked Roberts to the African coast, gathering intelligence from merchant captains about recent sightings and attacks. In February 1722, Ogle found Roberts's fleet anchored at Cape Lopez. Roberts had 3 ships and nearly 200 men, but he was careless. Success had made him confident, perhaps overconfident. Many of his crew were ashore or drunk. Ogle approached carefully. Roberts's consort ship, Ranger, spotted Swallow and gave chase, thinking it was an easy prize. Ogle led Ranger away from Roberts's main fleet, then turned and fought. After several hours of battle, Ranger surrendered. Ogle had captured 1/3 of Roberts' force. Ogle returned to Cape Lopez. Roberts saw Swallow approaching and could have fled. His ship, Royal Fortune, was fast and well armed, but Roberts chose to fight. He had never run from battle. He would not start now. Roberts dressed for the engagement in his finest clothes, a rich crimson waistcoat and breeches, a red feather in his hat, a diamond cross hanging from a gold chain around his neck. He looked magnificent, standing on the deck as Swallow approached. The first broadside from Swallow struck Roberts in the throat with grape shot. He died instantly. His crew, as he had instructed them, threw his body overboard rather than let his enemies take it. Royal Fortune fought on for another 2 hours before surrendering. The captured pirates were brought to Cape Coast Castle for trial. 54 were hanged, making it the largest pirate execution in history. Their bodies were left hanging in chains on the beach as a warning. The rest were sold into slavery or imprisoned. Black Bart's crew was destroyed utterly. Roberts's death marked another milestone in the destruction of Golden Age piracy. The most successful pirate captain, a man who had captured more than 400 vessels, had been killed by the Royal Navy. The hunters were winning. Jack Rackham had already fallen by this time, captured drunk and cowardly by Captain Barnett. His execution in November 1720 was unremarkable, except for Anne Bonny's scornful last words to him. His body was hung in chains at Plum Point, thereafter known as Rackham's Cay. Charles Vane had been captured and executed. Stedbonnet had been hanged. Edward England, another prominent captain, had been marooned by his own crew and died in poverty on Madagascar. The list of dead and captured grew longer each year. The Royal Navy was not the only threat. Colonial governments offered bounties for captured pirates. Pirate hunters, sometimes former pirates themselves, prowled the Caribbean seeking prey, and pirates faced another danger, their own crews. As the risks increased and prizes became scarcer, pirate crews grew desperate. Captains who failed to deliver plunder faced mutiny. Some crews turned on their captains, accepting pardons and turning their leaders over to authorities for reward money. The Brotherhood was fracturing under pressure. Consider the fate of William Fly. In 1726, Fly led a mutiny aboard the slave ship Elizabeth, killing the captain and taking over the vessel. He turned pirate, but his career lasted only 2 months. He captured 5 small vessels, treating his captives with unnecessary cruelty. When his own crew grew tired of his sadistic leadership, They mutinied against him and sailed to Boston, turning Fly over to authorities. Fly was hanged in July 1726. At his execution, he showed defiant courage, refusing to show any remorse. When the hangman botched the noose, Fly retied it himself with steady hands, lecturing the executioner on proper knot-tying before dropping to his death. His body was hung in chains on an island in Boston Harbor as a warning to sailors. By 1726, Golden Age piracy was effectively over in the Caribbean. The combination of naval patrols, pardons for those who surrendered, and brutal punishment for those who did not had broken the back of organized piracy. Pirates who remained at large operated in small crews, taking minor prizes, always running, always looking over their shoulders. But why did the suppression succeed when earlier efforts had failed? The answer lies in economics and politics. First, legitimate trade had grown, enormously valuable. The Caribbean colonies were producing sugar, tobacco, and other crops worth millions of pounds. Piracy threatened this trade. Previously, colonial governors had tolerated piracy because pirate gold enriched their colonies. By the 1720s, plantation profits exceeded anything piracy could provide. The economic incentive had shifted from tolerating pirates to suppressing them. Second, European naval power had grown stronger and more organized. The Royal Navy in particular had expanded dramatically. Ships were bigger, crews better trained, commanders more professional. The Navy could now maintain regular patrols that made piracy increasingly difficult. Third, the legal framework had tightened. The Piracy Act of 1721 allowed pirate trials to be held in colonial courts rather than requiring transportation to England. This meant faster justice pirates could be tried and executed locally, within weeks of capture. The deterrent effect was immediate and powerful. Fourth, the pardon system worked. Many pirates genuinely wanted to retire if they could do so safely. By offering amnesty, governments split the pirate community between those willing to surrender and hardliners who refused. This made the remainder easier to hunt. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, the social conditions that had created the Golden Age were changing. The War of Spanish Succession had ended in 1713, putting thousands of privateers out of work. Many had turned to piracy, but by the 1720s, legitimate employment had expanded. Merchant fleets were growing. Naval vessels needed sailors. Men who might have turned pirate now had alternatives. The pirate hunters understood all this. They were not just catching pirates, they were dismantling the entire system that sustained piracy. Some pirates escaped the noose through sheer luck or clever timing. Henry Avery, who had captured a treasure ship belonging to the Mughal Emperor in 1695, simply disappeared. He may have lived out his days quietly in England or Ireland. His fate remains unknown, but he certainly escaped justice. Others found refuge in places beyond European control. Madagascar became a legendary pirate haven, remote, ungoverned, impossible to patrol effectively. Pirates established settlements there, some taking local wives and attempting to build new lives. But even Madagascar was not entirely safe. The Royal Navy occasionally sent expeditions to break up pirate havens. A few pirates managed legitimate transitions. Benjamin Hornigold died while hunting pirates for Governor Rogers, the teacher who became the hunter of his former students. Others used their ill-gotten wealth to buy respectability, becoming merchants or plantation owners, their pirate pasts quietly forgotten or deliberately obscured. But most met violent ends. The sea claimed some in storms. Disease, especially yellow fever and malaria, killed others. Those who survived nature often fell to human enemies. The gallows, the firing squad, death in battle, these were the usual ends for pirates who refused to surrender. The executions were public spectacles designed to teach a lesson. Pirates were hanged at Execution Dock in London, at Gallows Point in Port Royal, at points along coastlines throughout the Atlantic world. Their bodies were sometimes hung in iron cages called gibbets, left to rot as warnings. Some gibbet cages remained in place for years, the remains within them picked clean by birds. The authorities wanted every sailor, every potential pirate to see what awaited those who raised the black flag. And the message worked. By 1730, fewer and fewer sailors chose piracy. The risks had become too great, the rewards too uncertain, the endings too grim. The great captains were gone. Blackbeard's head had hung from Maynard's bowsprit. Roberts lay at the bottom of the Atlantic. Rackham rotted in chains. Vane had been hanged. The Republic of Pirates was a memory. Nassau was a respectable British colony. The black flag had been struck from every mast. The Golden Age was over. But what had it proven? That sailors could govern themselves democratically. That rigid hierarchy was not the only possible model for society. That desperate men, given a choice between a brutal life of oppression and a dangerous life of freedom, would often choose freedom even knowing the cost. The pirate codes, democratic, egalitarian, providing for injured crew members, were more progressive than the laws governing legitimate sailors. Pirate ships were more democratic than most societies of their time. They proved that another way was possible, even if unsustainable, even if doomed. The hunters had won. The empires had triumphed. Order was restored. But something had been lost too, a wild moment of possibility, a brief flowering of maritime democracy, a challenge to the established order that could not be entirely forgotten. The last of the Golden Age pirates died or surrendered by the early 1730s. The Caribbean became safe for commerce. The age of the great merchant fleets and naval supremacy had arrived. Pirates who remained operated as isolated crews taking minor prizes, never achieving the organization or audacity of their predecessors. But the story was not quite finished. Piracy does not end, it simply changes form. As the Caribbean became too dangerous, pirates moved to new hunting grounds. The Mediterranean still had corsairs, the Indian Ocean beckoned, and in the Far East, in the vast waters of the South China Sea, piracy was about to reach scales that would make the Golden Age look like a rehearsal. The hunters had become the hunted, and the hunted had been caught or killed or driven into hiding. The game was over in the Atlantic. But elsewhere in the world, the sea wolves were gathering in numbers that would astound even the veterans of Nassau's glory days. The next chapter would be written in eastern waters, where pirate fleets would number not in dozens, but in hundreds of ships, where piracy would become an organized naval force that challenged empires and terrorized coastlines. The last sea wolves of the West had fallen, but in the East, the greatest pirate fleet in history was about to sail. While the Royal Navy was hunting down the last Caribbean pirates, halfway around the world a woman was building the largest pirate fleet in human history. Her name was Zheng Yi Sao, wife of Zheng Yi, and at the height of her power she commanded more than 1,800 vessels and 70,000 pirates. To put this in perspective, Blackbeard commanded perhaps 4 ships at his peak, Bartholomew Roberts perhaps 3 or 4. The entire pirate Republic of Nassau might have fielded 50 ships at most. Zheng Yi Sao commanded 1,800. She did not start as a pirate. Born around 1775, she worked on a floating brothel, one of the flower boats that serviced sailors in Canton. In 1801, she married Zheng Yi, a pirate captain from a family with generations of experience in the trade. Together, they began consolidating the fractured pirate groups of the South China Sea into a single confederation. This was piracy on an entirely different scale than the Caribbean had ever seen. The South China Sea was vast, home to thousands of islands and countless fishing villages. The Qing dynasty controlled China, but struggled to patrol effectively. Corruption was endemic, local officials could be bribed, and often were. Trade was immensely profitable, silk, porcelain, tea flowing from China to the world, and the coastal population was enormous. providing an endless supply of potential pirates. Zheng Yi understood that fragmented pirate bands would be suppressed one by one. United, they could be unstoppable. He and his wife created a confederation of 6 pirate fleets, each identified by colored flags: red, black, white, blue, yellow, green. Each fleet had its own commander, but all answered to Zheng Yi. It was piracy transformed into a naval force. Then, in 1807, Zheng Yi died, possibly in a storm, possibly in battle. The records are unclear. His widow was 32 years old. She could have retired on her accumulated wealth. Instead, she took command. Understand what this meant. In early 19th century China, women had virtually no political or military power. They were expected to be submissive, obedient, confined to domestic roles. Zheng Yisao shattered every expectation. She took command of the Pirate Confederation and held it together through force of personality, strategic brilliance, and absolute ruthlessness. She appointed Zheng Yi's adopted son, Chang Pao, as the operational commander of the Red Flag Fleet, the largest and most powerful. She may have married Chang Pao to cement her authority, though the historical sources are contradictory. What is certain is that she was the ultimate authority. Decisions of war and peace, of strategy and tactics, rested with her. Under her leadership, the Pirate Confederation became so powerful it effectively controlled the South China Sea. They did not merely raid, they taxed. Fishing boats paid protection money. Merchant vessels purchased safe passage documents. Coastal villages provided tribute. It was piracy evolving into government, predation becoming taxation. The pirates established their own legal codes. Desertion was punishable by death ears cut off first. Unauthorized plundering of villages that paid tribute resulted in severe punishment. Rape was forbidden and punishable by death. These were not casual raiders. This was an organized military force with discipline and structure. The Qing government could not tolerate this challenge to its authority. They sent naval expeditions. The pirates crushed them. They hired Portuguese mercenaries with European weapons and ships. The pirates captured their vessels. They blockaded pirate harbors. The pirates simply moved to other harbors among the thousands of islands. By 1810, the situation was desperate. The Pirate Confederation was so powerful that it was disrupting trade throughout the region. The government tried a different approach. They offered amnesty. Zheng Yisao negotiated shrewdly. She would not simply surrender and hope for mercy. She demanded terms. After months of negotiation, she got them. She and Chang Pao received pardons. Chang Pao was commissioned as a lieutenant in the Imperial Navy. They kept their wealth. The pirate crews who surrendered received amnesty and were not punished. It was an extraordinary outcome. The greatest pirate leader in history negotiated a comfortable retirement. Zheng Yisao lived until at least 1844, possibly longer, running a gambling house in Canton. She died wealthy and free, having commanded a pirate navy larger than most countries' official navies. Her story demonstrates something crucial. Piracy in Asia operated on different principles than in the Caribbean. The scale was larger, the organization more sophisticated, the relationship with government more complex. Pirates could become officials, officials could become pirates, and the boundaries between legitimate authority and maritime predation were constantly shifting. Piracy in Asian waters was not eliminated. It persisted for decades after Zheng Yisao's retirement, but her confederation was never matched in size or power. When the British Empire began asserting control over Asian trade routes in the mid-1800s, bringing steam-powered warships and modern naval tactics, traditional piracy faced technological challenges it could not overcome. Meanwhile, in the Mediterranean, the final chapter of the Barbary Corsairs was playing out. The Barbary states, Algiers, Tunis, Tripoli, had preyed on European and American shipping for centuries. They captured ships, enslaved Christian crews, demanded tribute from nations that wanted safe passage. It was a profitable arrangement sustained by European disunity and the difficulty of projecting power across the Mediterranean. The young United States had paid tribute to the Barbary states, like everyone else. But in 1801, the Pasha of Tripoli demanded more tribute. President Thomas Jefferson refused. Tripoli declared war. The First Barbary War lasted 4 years. American naval squadrons blockaded Tripoli. Marines and mercenaries assaulted Tripoli's defenses. It was here, in 1805, that the line, "To the shores of Tripoli," entered the Marine Corps hymn, Marines fighting North African pirates far from home. The war ended with a treaty favorable to the United States, but the Barbary corsairs continued raiding other nations' shipping. In 1815, after the Napoleonic Wars ended, the United States sent 2 naval squadrons to the Mediterranean. In what became known as the Second Barbary War, American forces captured Algerian ships and forced new treaties, eliminating tribute payments and freeing American prisoners. The British and Dutch followed with their own punitive expeditions. In 1816, a combined British and Dutch fleet bombarded Algiers for 9 hours, destroying the corsair fleet and freeing thousands of enslaved Christians. The city surrendered. The ancient practice of Barbary piracy was ending not because piracy became unprofitable, but because European naval power had grown overwhelming. Steam-powered warships could patrol effectively. Naval bombardments could reduce coastal fortifications. The technological and organizational advantages that had allowed small corsair fleets to challenge major powers had evaporated. France conquered Algeria in 1830, incorporating it into their growing North African empire. The Barbary corsairs, who had terrorized the Mediterranean for centuries, whose greatest captains like Barbarossa had become legends, simply ceased to exist as an organized force. And in the Caribbean and Atlantic, the last remnants of the Golden Age were flickering out. Jean Lafitte represents the final gasp of Caribbean piracy, and also its transformation into something more complex. Lafitte was born around 1780 in France. He and his brother Pierre established a smuggling and privateering operation based in Barataria Bay, Louisiana, in the early 1800s. Notice the terms smuggling and privateering, not piracy. Lafitte held letters of marque from Cartagena, a Colombian city fighting for independence from Spain. This technically made him a privateer, not a pirate. But the distinction was meaningless to the Spanish ships he captured and the American authorities who tried to suppress him. Lafitte's operation was sophisticated. He had a network of spies in New Orleans. He bribed officials. He operated a warehouse where smuggled goods were sold openly. He commanded perhaps 1,000 men and dozens of ships. It was piracy as organized crime, with political connections and economic integration into the legitimate economy. In 1814, the British approached Lafitte with an offer: support Britain in the coming war with the United States, receive rewards and pardons. Lafitte refused and informed American authorities of the British plans. When the British attacked New Orleans in January 1815, Lafitte and his men fought alongside American forces under Andrew Jackson. The Battle of New Orleans was an American victory, one of the most lopsided in American military history. Lafitte's artillerymen and their knowledge of the local waterways contributed significantly. Jackson praised Lafitte publicly, and President James Madison pardoned him for past offenses. It was a remarkable transformation from hunted pirate to military hero in a matter of months. But Lafitte could not stay legitimate. By 1817, he had established a new base on Galveston Island, Texas. Then, under disputed sovereignty, he resumed privateering, though increasingly his actions looked like simple piracy. In 1820, the United States Navy arrived at Galveston and informed Lafitte he had to leave. Lafitte burned his settlement and sailed away. he disappeared from history shortly after. Some accounts suggest he died in a battle off Honduras in 1823. Others claim he lived quietly in various locations for years. Like so many pirates before him, his ultimate fate is unknown. Lafitte represents a type that appears throughout pirate history. The romantic rebel who operates in legal grey zones, who can be hero or villain depending on political circumstances, who embodies both the freedom and the moral ambiguity of life outside the law. By 1830, organized piracy had effectively ended throughout most of the world. The combination of steam power, modern naval organization, colonial expansion, and international cooperation had made traditional piracy unsustainable. Small-scale piracy continued, isolated attacks in poorly policed waters, but the great pirate fleets, the legendary captains, the pirate havens were all gone. Why did piracy end when it did? Technology was crucial. Sailing ships had speed and maneuverability limited by wind conditions. A pirate sloop could catch a merchant ship because both depended on sail. Steam power changed everything. A steam-powered warship could pursue at any time, in any weather, without concern for wind direction. Pirates in sailing vessels simply could not escape. Communication also improved dramatically. Telegraph systems allowed rapid transmission of information about pirate attacks. Steamships could respond to distress calls. Naval patrols could coordinate effectively. The vast ocean was becoming a smaller, more connected, more policed space. Colonial expansion meant fewer ungoverned spaces. Madagascar, which had been a pirate haven because no European power controlled it, was colonized by France in 1896. Every island, every remote harbor, every potential pirate base fell under some nation's authority and naval patrol. International law evolved to treat piracy as a universal crime. Under the principle of universal jurisdiction, pirates could be captured and tried by any nation, regardless of where the piracy occurred or the pirate's nationality. This eliminated safe havens. There was nowhere a pirate could go to be safe from prosecution. But perhaps most importantly, economic conditions changed. In the 1700s, opportunities for legitimate employment at sea were limited and conditions were brutal. Piracy, despite its risks, offered better pay and more freedom than merchant or naval service. By the mid-1800s, conditions had improved. Wages were better, treatment less harsh, opportunities more abundant. The desperation that drove men to piracy had lessened. The last traditional pirates were hunted down or forced into retirement. In Southeast Asian waters, piracy persisted longer, small bands operating in the countless islands of Indonesia and the Philippines. But even there, increased naval patrols and colonial administration gradually suppressed organized piracy. By the late 1800s, the age of sail was ending. Steam and steel were replacing wood and canvas. The romance of maritime adventure was fading into nostalgia. Pirates became figures of history and legend rather than immediate threats. But consider what had been lost. For all their brutality, pirates had demonstrated that alternative forms of social organization were possible. Democratic governance, elected leadership, egalitarian distribution of wealth. These principles appeared on pirate ships a century before they became widespread in legitimate society. The pirate codes, with their provisions for compensating injured crew members and their democratic decision-making, were more progressive than contemporary laws. Women like Anne Bonny, Mary Read, and Zheng Yi Sao found opportunities in piracy that legitimate society denied them. Escaped slaves found freedom under the black flag that they could not find anywhere else. This is not to romanticize piracy. It was violent, predatory, often cruel. Pirates robbed innocents, killed resistors, sold captives into slavery. The pirate life was short and brutal for most who lived it. The democratic principles applied only to the pirate crew. Victims had no voice, no rights, no recourse. But the pirates proved something important, that the rigid hierarchies of their age were not inevitable or natural, that sailors could govern themselves, that desperate people, given a choice, would create systems of rough justice and mutual support. That freedom, even dangerous freedom, was worth fighting for. The last sea wolves were gone. The oceans were safe for commerce, patrolled by professional navies, governed by international law. The age of piracy, stretching from ancient Mediterranean raiders through Vikings and corsairs to the golden age of the Caribbean and the great Asian pirate confederations, had ended. Or had it? Because piracy does not truly end, it transforms. The conditions that create pirates, poverty, desperation, weak governance, valuable cargoes, opportunity, these persist. And whenever these conditions align, pirates reappear in new forms, using new tactics, but driven by the same ancient calculations of risk and reward. The wooden ships and cutlasses were gone, but the impulse that drove men to sea to take by force what they could not earn by labour that remained. And in the modern world, that impulse would find new expressions, new theatres, new forms. The sea wolves would return, though we might not recognise them at first. The game was not over. It had simply moved to a new board, with new pieces, waiting for conditions to align once more. In 1883, a Scottish author named Robert Louis Stevenson published a novel called Treasure Island. It was written as entertainment for his stepson, a simple adventure story about a boy who discovers a treasure map and sails to find pirate gold. Stevenson drew on historical accounts he had read extensively about Captain Kidd, Blackbeard, and other Golden Age pirates. But he transformed the brutal reality into something else entirely: romance. Long John Silver, the novel's pirate antagonist, is charming, witty, and complex, a far cry from the vicious criminals who actually sailed under the Black Flag. The Treasure Island is exotic and dangerous, but ultimately conquerable. The adventure is thrilling, but the good characters survive. Pirates become figures of fascination rather than terror, romance rather than revulsion. Treasure Island was enormously successful. It spawned countless imitations, inspired generations of adventure writers, and fundamentally shaped how we imagine pirates. The one-legged pirate with a parrot on his shoulder, the treasure map marked with an X, the buried chest of gold doubloons. These images come not from history, but from Stevenson's imagination. This transformation is remarkable. Consider the reality. Blackbeard died with bullets and sword wounds covering his body. Bartholomew Roberts's crew faced mass execution. Charles Vane hung in chains until his flesh rotted away. Anne Bonny and Mary Read languished in prison. The actual history of piracy is one of violence, disease, betrayal, and brutal ends. Yet within a century of the Golden Age's end, pirates had become heroes of children's literature. How did this happen? Part of the answer lies in distance. By the late 1800s, piracy was safely in the past. The last Golden Age pirates had been dead for more than a century and a half. There were no living victims to object to romanticization, no communities still traumatized by pirate raids. Time had sanded away the rough edges, leaving only the exciting outline. But there is more to it. Pirates represented something that Victorian society rigid, hierarchical, bound by strict social codes, found simultaneously threatening and appealing. Pirates chose freedom over security, adventure over comfort, danger over routine. They lived by their own rules, governed themselves democratically, divided their plunder fairly. They stood outside the constraints of civilization, and in doing so, they embodied a fantasy of escape. The transformation accelerated in the 20th century. Hollywood discovered pirates and fell in love. Douglas Fairbanks swashbuckled across silent film screens in The Black Pirate in 1926, performing incredible athletic feats and winning the day through courage and skill. Errol Flynn's Captain Blood in 1935 and the Sea Hawk in 1940 presented pirates as noble rebels fighting tyranny. These were not historical pirates. They were heroes who happened to sail under the Jolly Roger handsome, honourable, fighting injustice with a sword and a smile. The genre became so popular that pirate movie became its own category, with conventions as rigid as any naval code. The heroic captain, the comic sidekick, the beautiful captive who falls in love with her captor, the climactic sword fight, the buried treasure. Notice what disappeared in this transformation. The slavery pirates both fought it and practiced it. The torture pirates routinely tortured prisoners to discover hidden valuables. The disease yellow fever and scurvy killed more pirates than combat ever did. The casual brutality marooning, keel-hauling, summary executions. The exploitation pirates might divide plunder fairly among themselves, but their wealth came from robbing others. Hollywood gave us sanitized pirates, literature gave us romantic pirates, and popular culture embraced them enthusiastically because they represented an escape from modernity's constraints. In an increasingly bureaucratic, regulated, controlled world, pirates embodied radical freedom. The imagery became iconic. The skull and crossbones appears on everything from children's toys to rock band logos. Talk Like a Pirate Day is celebrated annually. Theme parks feature pirate attractions. The Pirates of the Caribbean film franchise has grossed billions of dollars worldwide. Jack Sparrow, a comedic, morally ambiguous anti-hero, has become one of cinema's most recognizable characters. But while Hollywood was romanticizing historical pirates, real piracy was returning, not in the Caribbean or the Mediterranean, but off the coast of Somalia. In the 1990s, Somalia descended into civil war and state collapse. The government ceased functioning, the navy dissolved, coastal waters went unpatrolled, and foreign fishing fleets moved in, illegally harvesting Somali waters, devastating fish stocks that coastal communities depended on for survival. Some Somali fishermen decided to fight back. They began boarding foreign vessels, demanding fees for fishing in Somali waters. It started as vigilante Coast Guard action, but it quickly evolved into hijacking for ransom. By 2000, Somali piracy was a growing problem. By 2008, it was an international crisis. Somali pirates operated differently than their historical predecessors. They used small, fast speedboats powered by outboard motors. They carried AK-47 assault rifles and rocket-propelled grenades instead of cutlasses and pistols. They targeted massive cargo ships and oil tankers vessels worth millions, carrying cargoes worth billions, staffed by small crews unable to defend themselves. The tactics were effective and terrifying. Pirates would approach in speedboats, sometimes in the middle of the night, sometimes in broad daylight. They would scale the sides of ships using grappling hooks and ladders. Once aboard, they would take control of the bridge, hold the crew hostage, and sail the vessel to Somali waters. Then they would negotiate ransom with the shipping company, typically millions of dollars. At the height of Somali piracy, between 2008 and 2011, pirates hijacked dozens of ships annually, holding hundreds of sailors hostage. They generated an estimated $160 million in ransom payments in 2011 alone. It was piracy as an organized industry, employing thousands of people in a failed state with few other economic opportunities. The international response followed historical patterns. Naval forces from more than a dozen nations deployed to the region. Convoys were organized. Warships escorted vulnerable vessels. Private security contractors began sailing on commercial ships, providing armed defense. The legal framework was updated. Pirates could be captured and prosecuted under international law. The campaign worked. By 2013, Somali piracy had declined dramatically. The combination of naval patrols, armed guards on ships, and prosecution of captured pirates made the risk too high and the success rate too low. Piracy did not disappear entirely, but it ceased to be the international crisis it had been. But notice the parallels to historical piracy. Somali pirates emerged from economic desperation in a region with weak governance. They succeeded because they had mobility advantages, fast boats that could strike and escape before naval forces responded. They failed when international cooperation brought overwhelming force against them, and when defenses on target vessels improved. The same pattern that destroyed Golden Age piracy improved naval power, better ship defenses, international cooperation, legal prosecution worked again in the 21st century. The technology changed, but the fundamental dynamics remained constant. Somali piracy also revealed something uncomfortable. Poverty and desperation still drive people to piracy. The romantic image of pirates choosing freedom over civilization does not apply here. Most Somali pirates were young men with no economic prospects, living in one of the world's poorest and most unstable countries. Piracy was not rebellion or adventure, it was desperation economics. This is closer to historical reality than Hollywood's swashbucklers. Most historical pirates were not rebels against tyranny. They were poor sailors who saw piracy as their best or only option for escape from grinding poverty. The democratic governance on pirate ships emerged, not from political philosophy, but from practical necessity. Crews had to cooperate to survive, and democracy prevented the tyranny that made naval service so unpleasant. But we prefer the romantic version. We want pirates to be rebels, not criminals. We want them to represent freedom, not desperation. We want Errol Flynn and Jack Sparrow, not desperate Somali fishermen with AK-47s. Why does the pirate legend endure? Why do we continue to be fascinated by these historical criminals? Part of the appeal is the treasure. The idea that vast wealth might be buried somewhere, waiting to be discovered, is irresistible. Never mind that most pirates spent their plunder quickly and died poor. Never mind that documented cases of buried treasure are vanishingly rare. The fantasy persists. X marks the spot, a chest full of gold doubloons and pieces of eight, waiting for someone bold enough to find it. Real pirate treasure does exist. Shipwrecks carrying valuable cargo rest on the ocean floor. Marine archaeology has recovered incredible artifacts from pirate-era vessels. But the treasure hunting is scientific, methodical, expensive, and heavily regulated. It bears no resemblance to the treasure maps and midnight digging of fiction. Part of the appeal is the pirate code, the idea that pirates governed themselves democratically, divided plunder fairly, and took care of injured crew members resonates with modern values. I admire the egalitarian principles, even while acknowledging that they applied only to the pirates themselves and not to their victims. The historical pirate codes were real and remarkably progressive for their time, but they were not constitutions, they were practical agreements among criminals about how to divide stolen goods and maintain order. Still, they demonstrate that even in lawless circumstances, humans create systems of rules and justice. Pirates were not anarchists. They were democrats operating outside the law. Part of the appeal is simply the romance of sail. Wooden ships crossing vast oceans dependent on wind and skill. Navigating by stars, this evokes a world we have lost. Modern container ships are technological marvels, but they lack poetry. A clipper ship in full sail, heeling over in the wind, spray flying from her bow, this stirs something in us. We mourn the passing of the age of sail, even as we acknowledge that modern shipping is safer, faster, more efficient, and part of the appeal is the freedom. In our regulated, monitored, controlled modern world, pirates represent escape. They answered to no authority. They went where they pleased. They lived by their own rules. Yes, their lives were short and brutal. Yes, most died violently or miserably, but for a moment They were free, or so we imagine. This is why pirate festivals attract thousands of people who dress up in period costume and pretend to be buccaneers. This is why pirate-themed restaurants and bars proliferate. This is why children play pirate games and adults watch pirate movies. We are not celebrating the historical reality, we are embracing the fantasy, the mythology, the archetype. The pirate represents something deep in human psychology. The outlaw hero, the rebel against unjust authority, the common person who seizes opportunity and damn the consequences. This archetype appears across cultures and throughout history. Robin Hood, Zorro, Han Solo, countless others. The pirate is simply one particularly vivid incarnation. But we should not forget the reality beneath the romance. Real pirates caused real suffering. They killed, enslaved, and terrorized. Their victims, merchant sailors murdered for resisting, captives sold into slavery, coastal villagers who fled in terror at the sight of strange sails. These people suffered horribly. The pirates' freedom came at others' expense. We can acknowledge both truths simultaneously. Pirates created remarkably democratic societies within their crews, while brutalizing everyone outside those crews. They chose freedom and adventure while engaging in theft and violence. They were both rebels against oppressive systems and criminals who victimized innocents. This moral complexity is part of their enduring fascination. The legend will persist because it serves purposes that historical accuracy cannot. We need rebels, need outlaws, need figures who stand outside the system and make their own rules. We need reminders that alternative forms of social organization are possible. We need adventures and escapes and fantasies of freedom. The pirate provides all of this. The ghost of the pirate, the romantic ideal, the swashbuckling hero, the democratic rebel. This is more powerful than any historical pirate ever was. Blackbeard killed dozens at most. His legend has reached millions. Bartholomew Roberts captured 400 ships. Robert Louis Stevenson's Long John Silver has captured millions of imaginations. In this sense, the pirates won. They sought glory and reputation, wanted their names to echo through history. Many succeeded beyond anything they could have imagined. We remember Blackbeard and Anne Bonny 3 centuries after their deaths. We forget the merchants they robbed, the naval officers who captured them, the governors who condemned them. The outlaws achieved immortality while the law-abiding faded into obscurity. But their victory is Pyrrhic. We remember a fantasy version, not the reality. We celebrate a sanitized pirate who never existed. The real pirates, brutal, desperate, doomed, are lost beneath layers of romantic mythology. Perhaps they would not mind. Perhaps to be remembered at all, even inaccurately, is victory enough. The sea wolves are gone. Their wooden ships rotted centuries ago. Their bones rest on the ocean floor or turn to dust in unmarked graves. But their ghost sails on in books and films, in theme parks and costumes, in the collective imagination of a world that has made them immortal precisely by forgetting what they actually were. And perhaps that is the final lesson of piracy. Legends are more powerful than facts, myths more enduring than reality, and the stories we tell ourselves matter more than the truth we forget. The pirate's ghost will sail forever because we need it, to need the reminder that once, even briefly, even at terrible cost, people chose freedom over security and adventure over comfort. The sea is no longer wine-dark with mystery and terror. We have mapped every inch, measured every depth, tamed every wave with steel and steam. The age of maritime adventure is over, replaced by GPS navigation and container shipping and satellite communication. The romance is gone, replaced by efficiency and safety and profit margins. But the ghost remains. The black flag still flies in our imagination. The pirate's call still echoes. A merry life and a short one, freedom on the waves, fortune for the bold. We know it is fantasy. We know the reality was brutal and brief. But we listen anyway, and sometimes, in our safest moments, we imagine answering. The sea wolves are gone. Long live their legend. The last of the pirates died centuries ago, but the pirate will never die. The ghost sails on, under the Jolly Roger, toward a horizon that never arrives, eternal in the one place where pirates can truly live forever. Our dreams of what it means to be free